So there are three priorities that the next regional council has to focus on. The first priority is we have to safeguard Christchurch's drinking water. We have to protect Christchurch's aquifers, and this is mainly from agricultural nutrient input across the plains. The second priority is we have to support public transport, we have to support our buses, and we have to support trains and future mass rapid transit. And the third priority is we have to increase flood protection funding as a result of increased climate events. And so that is the kind of policy platform that the three of us are standing on, and if we're elected, they're the things that we're going to take forward with us. Overhanging this election and overhanging government in New Zealand at the moment is resource management reform, which this government and which Minister Christopher Bishop are pushing, and it's been likened to a guillotine that is hanging over the regional council's head at the moment, as we do not know, our future is uncertain, we do not know the function and form of regional councils going forward. And we were created in 1989 as an amalgamation of various local government and catchment board functions, and we're pretty much in a perpetual cycle of reform because we have such a centralised government in New Zealand. And I'll touch on that as I get into the slides. But on that note, the next council has to manage those conversations with grace, with calm, with sensibility, and we have to do it in the best interest of the ratepayers of Canterbury and Christchurch, because it would be very easy in these times of uncertainty to use this tension, to use this guillotine that is hanging over regional councils, to use that as a political platform or even an ego platform, as sometimes may happen in politics. And so the next council has to handle this period with grace and integrity. Okay, so this diagram here that I've done up here. So looking a bit deeper on some of the slides that Brittany has done in the last couple of weeks around the nature of pluralism, around the nature of our democratic system. And here we see a bit of an interface between these organs, between these institutions, between the state. And the question that I want to ask you is around this notion of sovereignty, because you may have heard the line that Parliament is sovereign. What is this? Does anyone want to describe what this means? Okay.
No, they'll describe it. We talked about it.
Oh, you did talk about it?
Hey, everyone.
Oh, that's all right. We can continue on. So, in essence, what that means is that the political authority of this country stems from Parliament. Now, on paper, de jure, de facto, you may have learnt about the difference between those two terms. De jure meaning in law, de facto meaning in fact and practice. De jure, we have the reality that the monarch is sovereign, the crown is sovereign. King Charles II in London is New Zealand's sovereign. But in practice, in de facto, Parliament is sovereign, and that is the result of our history. That is the result mainly through the 19th century, when the European settlers who were arriving here took control of their political autonomy, their political authority, through the form of their House of Representatives, through the form of Parliament. And Parliament is the supreme organ of political authority in this country. It actually is, in essence, the Supreme Court. We say that we have a Supreme Court, but the reality is Parliament is the Supreme Court. And why do I say that? That's because Parliament can legislate to remove the Supreme Court. Parliament could legislate to amend the Supreme Court's terms of reference. And so again, looking at this diagram, let's understand this a bit further. So Parliament provides the law of the land, it's the legislature. Law of the land that becomes policy that affects our lives. Parliament supplies the executive in the form of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, what we call government. The Cabinet Ministers are the head of government departments and ministries. Above the Prime Minister is the Governor General, who is the Crown's representative in New Zealand. And as we know, the Governor-General is a ceremonial role, but it is a very important role of state, because if law of the land that is legislative arrives at the Governor-General's desk, until a signature is put on that piece of paper, that is not law. It is not law of the land. And then supplying all of this, which is really essential to the whole system, is demos, which is the Greek term for people, which we know forms the word democracy. And so we have a democratic system where our parliament is elected through representatives, through members of parliament, from the people and by the people, by the demos. Why is this system special, and why do we value it in the way we do in Western democracies? Why is this a special system? There's a kind of theme within it that I know you've talked to, I know Brittany has introduced to you. What is it?
No one has absolute power.
Yeah. You're going to
Everyone gets a say.
Yeah.
Decision making.
In a way, yes, but yeah, it's this answer here. It's around the separation of power. That is to say that there are safeguards in every single one of these arrows here that prevent political executive authority being centralized into one office. For example, Parliament can change the law, Parliament can remove the Prime Minister and Cabinet, Parliament can remove the Supreme Court, the people can elect the new Parliament, the Governor-General technically could, if a tyrannical law came through Parliament, the Governor-General could say no. The Crown could appoint a new Governor-General if that Governor-General became tyrannical. And so throughout this whole system, we have a system of checks and balances, safety guards, and that is basically the essence of pluralism. And that is to say a separation of power, and so that we do not have tyranny. Because totalitarianism, which is the opposite politically from a pluralist democracy, power is centralized into a single office. So a system of dictatorship in which the law is written by a small group of people within the executive. There might be what's the word, like a pseudo legislature, but the reality is the law will come through the executive will direct the judiciary, and the executive will exercise power. So a little bit more, this is from the slides that you've been looking at, separation of power between these three. And then the question here, how separate are they? So the judiciary, yes, it's independent. The executive and legislative, not so much. I'm just going to contest, I don't necessarily agree exactly with this around there not being too separate, because yes, the government has to have a majority in the House of Representatives to function, and yes, they will hold confidence of the House, but they are separate in the sense that Parliament can remove the executive through a process of Parliament. And so even if they are on the same songbook, and they have to be, a government has to supply the command of the House, they have to be able to pass a budget, they are technically in their own lanes legally, even if politically you have, as we have now, a coalition led by the National Party supplying our government with a majority in the House. And you notice in other democratic systems, this difference is much more pronounced when you have a larger House of Representatives. So in the United Kingdom, for example, you have far more rebellions than we have here, because you have a House of Representatives with 600-700 seats. It's a lot harder to command that 350 majority, whereas here you have a government of 61 MPs. Most of them MPs are quite set on going into government in the future, and so they will generally hold the line of their government. We don't have as much rebellion in the House in New Zealand. So a little bit around where law comes from. Government bills, members' bills, local bills, private bills. Local bills are quite interesting, like they're a little bit less well understood, I would say, within our system. And the one that really affects the Canterbury Regional Council is around the Ngāi Tahu Representation Act that I think you may have looked at a little bit, maybe not. And that is that's a piece of law that came through the Regional Council, and it relates to the representation of council and having two mana whenua appointments. And as a result of it being a local bill, this government have in their coalition agreements between ACT and National to remove that piece of law, to remove mana whenua representation on the Regional Council. The Minister for Local Government wrote to the Regional Council and said to us, we would like you to repeal that bill. The Regional Council said, we will decline that invitation because we're happy with the representation. And so as a result, the government would have to actually go through another process. They would have to amend their standing orders of the House of Representatives to repeal that local bill. So this is the process here that you've seen around how law moves through the House of Representatives. And the thing here to note again is that theme that we talked to before around checks and balances, around separation of powers. Even in this system here, baked into this system, is checks and balances. Is to say, actually, law needs to be scrutinised because sometimes there's errors in law. Sometimes law will contain things with loopholes, it will contain things that may harm people. And so you thrash it out in this process to make sure that it's getting scrutiny, to make sure it's good law, to make sure it's robust. You kick the tyres on it before it goes to the Governor-General and is signed into an act. So a bill becomes an act. But what is the term when you bypass all of this? Anyone know? Yeah, urgency. So the government can provide a rationale for needing to move quickly, and they can pass law in a day through urgency. And when a government does that, it is criticised quite significantly because it's removing the checks and balances. And I would probably contest that a government has a limited amount of political capital it can spend on using urgency in their term in office. This government has been using it quite a lot in its 2 years so far. Right, now let's drill down. So we've talked about the structures of the state at a parliamentary level as Parliament being sovereign. And so now we're just going to come down a notch into government, into regional, local government, into territorial government. So the Resource Management Act, which is a law of the land, 1991 it became an act. It basically is the guideline, the blueprint for regional councils, for how they operate, for the functions they have to perform, and how they're to operate. The Resource Management Act also provides outlines for how policy is established. Policy is both informed by council, that is to say, council establishes policy. The executive government also puts out policy in the form of national policy statements under the RMA. And those national policy statements will inform council policy, regional policy statements, and vice versa. And then out of that falls resource management itself. And again, we have another layer of safeguard here where the people, the demos, elect our councillors. They elect the executive of the council, which is the council itself. The council then employs a chief executive officer, who, as I say, was a staff member here before her time at the Regional Council. She employs every other officer. Again, a separation of power between the operations of the council and the executive. So this term resource management, what does this mean?
The sustainable management of natural physical resources for future generations.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, good definition there. So the sustainable management of resources, of planning, of the environment. It is again a checks and balance on the resources that we have as a country, as a region, to enable that resources their management is regulated, that there is not that the cost of the environment is understood, and in some cases limited, but you're always provided with this tension between economic development and environmental protection. Resource management really sits in the space between these two forces, and over time, one of these processes, one of these kind of situations has definitely kind of come out on top in this tension, and that of course is economic development, because that's what we know. As humans, and Colin will go into this, we love to manipulate our environment to increase our living standards, to increase our populations, to increase technology, and the environmental movement in protecting the natural world is a relatively modern one. Again, I'll probably leave Colin more to speak to that, but we are in a lot of reform around resource management. We had a Labour government that came in 2017 that wanted to reform the system because they felt that the safeguards weren't there, that our water was in decline, that our soil health was in decline. And so they went through this huge process through Parliament to reform it. They got it through. It was one of the last pieces of law that went through in the last Labour government in 2023. National got in. By Christmas, that reform was axed. We went back to the 1991 law, which we still operate in. The last 2 years, Christopher Bishop and the government have been going through another form of resource management reform that is ongoing, and we are still to fully understand the nature of it. But reading between the lines, it is very much going to be focused on private property rights. Probably the reduction of mana whenua rights around their resources, because that's as well like why New Zealand is in such an interesting place with regard to resource management, is because of the Treaty of Waitangi, which Article 2 really relates to resources. It offers te reno rangatira taka to mana whenua or tangata whenua over their resources, over their forests, over their fisheries, and so that again is another layer of tension in all of this. Here it is. Version as at 5th of April 2025, that's because there's been a series of amendments made to this Act in the last 12 months. So I've only got a couple more slides here, but just to look at around definitions, because definitions within this game, within resource management, are essential. Key word here is around consent. So resource consent for an activity. This definition here has provided the region, goodness only knows how much money the Regional Council has spent on lawyers trying to understand this definition in relation to landowners wanting to do things with the waterways and land use on their farms. River means a continually or intermittently flowing body of fresh water and includes a stream and modified watercourse, but does not include any artificial watercourse, including an irrigation canal, water supply race, canal for the supply of water for electricity power generation, and farm drainage canal. So lawyers will be paid a lot of money to fight in court over that. clause 87, types of resource consent. The key thing here is around these terms that are in bold here. So land use consent, subdivision consent, coastal permit, water permit, discharge permit. So it's all around management of the environment. And on that, I'll pass to Colin Meurk.
While we get Colin Meurk's slide up, so I actually made them available. Is that okay, Colin?
Sorry?
Students. Is it
Yes,
okay?
oh yes,
Yeah,
I'll, I'll provide a PDF.
It's
uh,
under
to
the
put
learn
it
page.
to load
Don't
on
bring
the
them up.
site, or you can make a PDF of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's already done.
on there.
Yeah, I've got it. But if anyone's got any questions, does anyone have any questions for Joe while I get Colin's slides up for me?
I hope it does work this time.
Is
Oh.
the reform of the OMA affecting the ability for currently?
It basically at the moment we can't do any planning, so we can't notify any plans, so that's affected what we're able to do. Our planners are still kind of the opinion that we can still be doing work that would inform planning, but we don't know what the new planning regime is going to look like. So yeah, so there has been a lot of stuff put on ice, yeah, and there has also been, as a result of the limbo that we're in, the regulatory limbo around land use, around the previous government's national policy statement on water limits, on nutrient limits, we have seen a proliferation of cows on the plains in the last 6 months, which is quite negative. Yes.
Does ECAN control energies renewable energy?
So we regulate the hydroelectric scheme in South Canterbury, because as we know we have kind of a remarkable scheme running from Lake Takapō down the Waitaki. So we're very much in relationship with those companies and we regulate them. And we're also looking more at solar generation on ECAN land, because ECAN owns about 25,000 hectares of land up the rivers, so there's quite a bit of work doing to see if we could actually put some solar farms on our public land, which is quite positive. But again, there is an environmental consequence of that. Great. Colin.
Kia ora koutou. Called Colin Meurk ONZM. I'm born Kiwi. I've got Swedish and English ancestry, which is where my name comes from, the Swedish side. And I'm standing for the Christchurch West electorate, Opuna, which means the springs, which are all the western suburbs that have the springs that feed the rivers into Christchurch, which is kind of rather a nice concept. So I'm going to be talking a lot more sort of on the ground, in the green level, rather than quite an esoteric sort of aspect of this discussion, and dealing with the very complicated and difficult issues of how you actually place value on intrinsic values, how things which can't easily be quantified or monetized, and yet they're extremely important, but at a very sort of cloudy kind of way, and it's hard to actually nail it down and present an overwhelming case for protecting nature unless you can actually demonstrate there will be an economic benefit, an economic return, or some sort of saving of money down the track. So I'm just going to sort of jump in and throw a whole lot of different ideas to you, and you might say, well, which one am I here? But all of us, I think, who stand for local government or any level of government, obviously have been asking these kinds of questions and making these kinds of statements about the state of the world, where we're going, why are we here, what's ahead of us, and how are we going to respond to that. So, there've been people like Gramps there sort of saying this for decades, literally. In other words, it's not a new idea. but still there's a lot of skepticism out there, and difficulty of actually drawing it into making solid policies and plans to deal with some of these existential issues. As I've sort of indicated, my background is more in the sort of ecological area, so I'm going to be sort of focusing very much on nature, nature-based solutions, the threat to nature, but also the value of nature and how it feeds into our well-being. Again, very sort of esoteric and difficult to sort of quantify kind of stuff. But here's a bit of quantity. This shows the incredible dominance of humanity and its domestic animals on the planet. Over 95% of the mammalian biomass on this planet, terrestrial material, is actually either directly human, which is the big solid block in the middle, or domestic animals and livestock, all the grey stuff. The tiny little green bits around the fringe are all that's left of wild animals, and this is diminishing all the time. I mean, even just looking at that, you'd have to kind of, most people would say, well, that's rather surprising, if not alarming. We're all familiar with the fact that, given that we're in the midst of the 6th great extinction, according to many authorities, and that's just one of the many planetary boundaries that have been described by Rockström and have been sort of developed further into the notion of donut economies by Kate Raworth. So these ideas have been floating around for a while now, and it leads into a different form of economics, circular economies, well-being based economies rather than gross domestic product being the kind of measure of these things. Here's an ecologist who thought how we can provide scientific responses to the environmental problems in the world, and finally concluded that the real problem is people. Okay, well, let's hope that people can be both the solution as well as the problem. So we need to kind of rethink these things. And I do note that as an ecologist, I often like to point out to economists that ecology and economics come from the same Greek root word, which is oikos, meaning the home. In other words, economics is about the inputs and outputs and the circular movement of materials in the domestic environment scaled up to whole nations or the world. Ecology is the same kind of thing about the total environment and all of the elements of life and inanimate material in the universe, and importantly, how these things sort of balance out. So fundamentally, both ecology and economics are holistic concepts. They're supposed to accommodate everything, including the what are called externalities. In other words, the unintended consequences or the downstream effects or impacts of economic decisions. Sadly, both ecology and economics in recent times have tended to become more reductionist and more sort of channelized, and they kind of lose that holistic and convergent with Mataranga Māori sort of notions. So, there's a lot of interesting dynamics around all of these sorts of issues. At root level, we're dealing with sort of human nature, human personality, and the spectrum of that amongst humanity. And, the different sort of dominant aspects to personality. And I guess the question for all of us is, we can't run away from that. That exists. This is quite sort of polarized kind of representation of that. But the thing is, we can't turn our back on any of it. How do we accommodate all of that range of, ideas, attitudes, perspectives, values within a cohesive, functional society. And that, I guess, is our challenge as politicians, or aspiring politicians. And sort of following on from that, there's a lot of stuff out there about characterising, some of the dominant attitudes that seem to be prevailing at the moment in global politics. And I've sort of been contemplating this, like us all, for a long time, and looking at the tactics and how you overcome these sort of dominant tactics of what some people have characterised as sociopathic kind of tendencies. So first of all, you promise the earth, you tell lies often enough and it becomes the truth. When those promises are starting to fail to be realised, you start to get anxiety in the population. And that's when, the blame game starts to set in. You blame the previous government, you point the finger at an out-group, you give them some sort of name like woke, loony lefties or whatever. And then, of course, the next step is to actually punish those people. And it's all been, happened in history before. We can all think of examples of that. And it comes back to us about, in this famous saying about for evil to triumph, it only takes good people to do nothing. Well, I've kind of put some bracketed sort of caveats on that, because I don't think it's good people doing nothing. I think it's people who are actually overwhelmed by the demands that are placed on them. And academia is one of those cases. I mean, I see it both here and at Canterbury University, where the staff are overwhelmed by the demands of teaching and marking and keeping everything going, even though they've got the knowledge and intelligence to actually address a lot of these global issues. They often just don't have the free space to kind of get on with it. And of course it raises all sorts of interesting questions about, we've seen Joe's presentation of government structure and stuff, but all this sort of fits within what we sort of believed is kind of where we sit on this universe, which we call civilization. Are we actually civilized? Are we kind of moving towards an ever better and improved civilization, or are we letting it sort of dissipate and fall away? The other sort of theoretical sort of ideas about how to fit needs and the dynamics of society, Maslow's hierarchy, probably familiar with this. Of course, we all need basic, air, water, food, shelter and so on to survive in, and then you elevate these up to ultimately sort of transcendence, and that's what the title of my talk was about, really. How we sort of transition step by step to a soft landing on a future trajectory without frightening the horses. I mean, that's my sort of punchline, I suppose. As I said, these things have all been sort of thought through before. There was a publication 20 years ago now on strong sustainability model, that ring there on the bottom left. And importantly, it doesn't put economics as the sort of dominating and overriding consideration in how we manage the planet, but it recognises that we cannot escape the fact that we live within a biosphere, within a biological system. And within that is a social system, the sociosphere, and the economy fits within that. It's not at the top, even sort of triple bottom line ideas, kind of have these three things, sometimes called the I've forgotten, never mind. All sorts of other things, Roundtable of Human Future, going back to Club of Rome, all of these ideas. I'm going to flick through that because you can look at that at your leisure. But what I was going to sort of show is a very sort of practical sort of application of this kind of thinking around a current bill before Parliament that's was open to submissions, and I made a written submission, and I presented an oral presentation just the other day. You're given 5 minutes. It's hardly time to have a detailed conversation about anything. But this is the Game Animal Council's Herds of Special Interest Amendment Bill. And it's basically designed to change the whole purpose of the National Parks Act, which is predominantly designed to protect the special, unique biodiversity of our land in our national parks, to one which is designed to protect an introduced mammal, i.e. certain kinds of deer, for the benefit of hunters, and recognising their valuation of these breeds of deer, which maybe have diminished in their homeland, without, and also, of course, under the present regime, where economic growth is regarded as the overwhelming purpose that we should be pursuing. And so it's recognised that, please.
Sorry to interrupt. Is there a book here that you need to
Sorry?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, don't know what's going on here. I can tell you there's all sorts of weird things been going on this morning. I mean, first of all, my USB wouldn't work. Secondly, I got a lovely cup of coffee, thank you very much, Brittany. But I went in to get some sugar, and by accident I put salt in it. So anyway, this is life that we're talking about. Of course, the economic benefits of having herds of wild animals is that people pay a lot of money, certain people who are wealthy pay a lot of money to come to New Zealand to go and hunt, some sort of rare deer species, and so there's actually some economic sort of benefit. Anyway, but their claim by the Game Animal Council and members of the government is that this could lead to potentially better benefits to conservation. Well, as an ecologist, I don't think any ecologist was involved in that consultation. So my response, very quickly, and again there's 9 bullet points, but I'll just highlight some of the major statements. World facing 6th grade extinction, and New Zealand contributes a disproportionate sort of risk in that area. Our national parks are UNESCO World Heritage status, which has special purpose in preserving our biological heritage. It's sad that the proposed legislation seems to be being carried out with any science or evidence, which is kind of rather ironic when we know that all of the emphasis at the moment in education is about STEM and numeracy. Excuse me, isn't that supposed to then be sort of evidence-based and to understand, the value of actual outcomes? Of course, the problem here, as I've already alluded to, is that it's hard to quantify some of these intrinsic values. Anyway, there's a whole lot of reasons, and there's a whole lot of evidence, though, that shows that areas which don't have deer and don't have introduced mammals preserve our indigenous nature, natural ecosystems and forests, and the moment you introduce these introduced animals, they start to wipe them out because our native plants and animals evolved in the absence of land mammals, unlike continental areas. Right, and this has all been spelt out. Many of our species have zero tolerance of browsing, and even if we have a sort of a sustainable kind of deer herd, everything will get reduced to the lowest common denominator. So, I'm going to claim that biodiversity isn't just a nice to have, it is fundamental to our identity, sense of place, the Ranga Waiwai, and you might say from an economic perspective, authentic tourism. I mean, why do people come here if it's only to see something that they've got back home? They come here to see something that's unique and special to our place. And, you know, there's increasing evidence that all of these fundamental values are correlated with genuine well-being, and that, of course, drops down into cost of living, to cost of medical in the society, and you know, longevity and all sorts of other things. So this herds of special interest bill seems to be blind to all of these things. However, and this is where it comes back to how do we deal with the fact that there are polarised views about this in society, and accepting that value is placed on game animals, and I should add also pets, and particularly dogs, validly by a sector of the community, there needs to be an open, evidence-based conversation among all parties around how to accommodate these values while at the same time fulfilling our international duty to be guardians of our unique contribution to global biodiversity, rather than rushing through poorly thought-out legislation. So what that might actually look like on the ground? Well, fundamentally, it might involve clear segregation of New Zealand nature parks on the one hand, and game parks and dog parks on the other. In other words, if you try to blend the two things together, there'll be consequential losses. And I've seen this work, you know, played out in places like Stewart Island. Anyway, and I concluded by saying I'm happy to be a part of this conversation, and like many of you should be as well. Right, I'm going to quickly flick through, I don't know how much time I've got, I'm going to quickly flick through a whole lot of pictures, all right, which kind of try to illustrate some of the points that I'm making here. So, I've already mentioned that New Zealand is unique biogeographically in the world, and that it is a microcontinent, but it evolved in the absence of land mammals, and this has a considerable impact not only on the rare and endangered species that occur here, which have special significance in the world. For example, our little frog down the bottom there is ancestral to all of the frogs of the world. And, you know, when one of our ministers sort of says, oh, we've got to have mining up in the Coromandel, and there's some rare frogs up there, and he says, goodbye, Freddie. He's got no understanding that this is actually a Jurassic level frog that is not represented anywhere else in the world. It is one of the most significant animals that we have in this country. Secondly, the little rock wren there, which is now confined to some mountain areas, but is increasingly threatened by predators, is ancestral to all of the songbirds of the world. You know, these are incredibly significant organisms, and those are just two examples. However, you know, these introduced predators like stoats and ferrets and so on are attacking our wildlife. And browsing animals, of course, have the effects that we've already described in the forests. Sheep, however, can be useful as management tools because we've got all these introduced grasses which will bury little native plants if we don't manage that. And so, you know, there are some possible uses of these animals, and of course, you know, I understand agriculture and exotic forestry is fundamental to our economy. You know, can't escape from that, and I'm not denying that, absolutely. So we somehow have to kind of balance and work together and ensure that all of those values are protected, not everything reduced to a bland common denominator. Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but there are 8 levels of conservation that I believe are critical to preserving our unique biodiversity. The first level is to protect. In other words, every remaining last bit of nature, even if it's degraded, must be protected. We've already lost way, way too much, especially in the lowlands. We can't afford to lose any more, and yet we still are. And I'll show a picture of that in a minute. Secondly is to remove pest species from areas where they're in conflict with nature. Thirdly is to facilitate regeneration. Fourthly then is to get out there and plant trees and restore habitats. Fifthly is to integrate this across whole landscapes and to ensure that there's connectivity through the wider spatial environment, not only between patches and corridors, but between people and nature. Then there's an enrichment phase for that restoration, where you bring in all of the less common species and understory species that need protection before they can grow. Sanctify, what on earth does that mean? What it means is establishing sanctuaries in order to provide, if you like, baskets for our rare eggs. There's a aspiration for predator-free New Zealand, but this isn't realisable in any near-time future. And so in the meantime, we need to have sanctuaries to preserve our endangered, iconic wildlife throughout the country, not only from the point of view of protecting the wildlife and ensuring there's a representative cross-section of habitats providing those sanctuaries, but also to provide the opportunity accessibly for people to actually interact with that nature. Because as we sometimes say, extinction of experience, in other words, if you don't know something exists, leads to extinction of species, because you don't know that it's there to be protected, and you can't identify with it. And finally, transcendence. That's what the whole thing is about. Bringing about that stage where we have that aha moment and we think, wow, look at those native totara and kakatea sort of starting to sprout up all over the place, and all the wildlife that's starting to feed on the berries, and you know it generates that ecological revelation, ecological literacy as opposed to numeracy and financial literacy, and identity, te ranga waiwai, and that leads then into a desire to look after it, the kaitiaki stage. So just a few pictures to show these. This is, and I'll go back to the definition of river that Joe referred to earlier, which excluded things which were artificial, like water races. However, the stock water races across the Canterbury Plains were constructed 150 years ago, so they're heritage features in their own right, and they absorbed all of the wetland and riparian species that existed across the wider plains before they got eliminated by industrial agriculture. So they actually are natural systems. So it's an interesting case in point. I'm in the process of trying to get those protected now, but while the local councils have got a proposal to decommission them and get rid of them because they're too expensive to maintain and they're an annoyance to the farmers and stuff. Anyway, also there's still a few scattered shrubs along our roadsides which are original, because they never would have established once grazing animals were in the system, because most of our native woody plants just cannot establish in the presence of grazing animals. They just have no resistance to that kind of browsing, or they get overwhelmed by tall exotic grasses competitively. Right. Then there's regeneration. Once you've controlled pest species, enable all those little seedlings to establish. Then out there planting, and I'm sure some of you have been doing that. We're then scaling up to whole landscapes and creating patches that are within foraging distance of wildlife, of birds, and that's facilitated further by having actual physical corridors along stream sides, along roads and so on. And the important thing about this is that there are people living in the matrix between these, interacting with those birds that are foraging in and around those patches. So it's a total kind of rebuilding of connectivity, both ecologically and socially. So, you know, they sometimes call it the halo effect. There's an ecological halo and there's a sociological halo. We can incorporate these patches into quite small spaces. This was an exhibit in a flower show, which was just 10 by 10 metres, and it included all of the urban environments within that small space, occupied entirely by indigenous species. So there's all sorts of ways in which we can incorporate nature, including in lawns and footpath cracks, and as well as in patches of bush. We can incorporate nature into intensified urban development. You know, we can have bathing, forest bathing, out our office window. It's a matter of design and understanding and knowledge about what's available out there, how we can use this, how we can incorporate New Zealand species into there and generate that sense of identity. Corridors are important because they're visual, and visibility is important to conservation. And along the corridors, not only along roads but along rivers. Sponge cities are the new thing as well. Green roofs, treatment trains that trap water and slow the water, attenuate water flow and reduce stormwater. And you have little detention basins there. In fact, that picture there on the bottom right is from just outside there. So making it very relevant. There were solar panels on the roof there as well. There are all sorts of ways of incorporating nature and combining indigenous species with exotic species, which are favoured, you know, like deciduous trees in our parks to reduce the winter shade. But we can incorporate some beautiful kowhai trees there, which are important nectar suppliers for our native honey-eating birds like korimako and tui. And of course community gardens, all sorts of things there, enabling a little bit of urban wild. Of course, after the earthquakes in Christchurch, this allowed a whole lot of sort of plant succession to take place, a little bit like after the war in Europe, actually, when urban ecology really took off, surprisingly, because there was so much kind of rubble and broken land that it enabled a whole lot of natural ecological processes to be re-established in what had otherwise been highly controlled and managed environments. And as a result, there were all sorts of interesting little native plants popped up here, like things from riverbeds, like little grasses there and ferns and what have you. And here's the sort of sanctified stage, creating these sanctuaries. Of course, we've got one little one at Riccarton Bush with a fence around it, but we need much bigger ones like Zealandia and Wellington and Maungatautari and the Waikato, and they're just getting a new one in their city. But Canterbury and Christchurch is devoid of, it's got a huge gap in terms of this provision for our wildlife and the accessibility to humanity. And so Joe will confirm this. We've got a proposal to actually put money, significant money, into establishing eco-sanctuaries in Canterbury to rebuild that connectivity. All sorts of beauty, yeah, you know, nature, you know, appreciating the environment we live in, the sky, using walkways like the Christchurch 360 Trail, which I lead, to experience, you know, the diversity of our place and to promote our local region. Some good examples of just the Christchurch 360 Trail, 140 kilometre walk around the city. Building responsibility, love and care of nature and people.
Can I just say that I've been doing the 360 trail with my daughter?
Oh, right.
We've been doing, so you can walk the whole of the Christchurch, which is pretty cool. So we've been kind of doing one section
Right.
every weekend.
Thank you.
Now-
Oh, well, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's really, really, really cool. You guys should have a look at it. I mean, it's like doing kind of urban tramping where
Yeah.
you don't need to go anywhere. It's right there at your back door. There's a couple of stretches which we didn't love. The
Right.
one from that goes past Arana Park in the airport area.
Oh, yeah.
That was quite. It
Yes, oh yeah, that goes out to where Raywood Fresh
exactly.
was.
Yeah, we stopped at Rayward Fresh. at the
Yes,
end for a
yes,
juice.
which doesn't exist anymore there
No,
now.
it was quite an intense walk with the airport. It was a hot, dusty
Yeah.
day, and walking past that kind of.
Yes.
But it's,
There is another version of that route, but anyway, we'll come
anyway,
back to that.
It's very cool. So you can walk the whole of Christchurch. Sorry,
Yeah, so I've just got just a few last pictures which show, drawing all of these ideas into our understanding, our, reflection on the planet, on our place. Actually, a landscape architecture student drew up that sort of idea of the Cathedral, not rebuilding it, but actually preserving the ruins and creating a tower with a viewing platform in the square, Cathedral Square, with Bush City, a bit like the Wellington thing, incorporating all the nature. Having a raised platform which has viewing shafts out to all of the diversity of our cultural landscape as well as our natural landscape. There's Putaringamotu, the Regenerative bush there, but you recognise all of the other components to our diverse culture here, and celebrating and creating a beacon of love, life and light. So it's kind of aspirational. One of the kind of concepts of also is bringing all of these things together into a national park city concept. It's controversial. Some people think it undermines the notion of national park, but no, it's intended to turn things on its head and say we live in nature, we're not separated from it. Our national parks aren't something that should only exist out in the distant mountains where only a few people go to visit. Regenerative technology, but incorporating, here's like, the Gideon Bibles in our motels. Maybe we need a biodiversity Bible there. Anyway, how long can we wait for all of this? We need to get on with it. Some key messages, yes, you've heard all of those. I'm going to move on to the next one. So I think these really are the summation of what I've been sort of trying to get across. Hope, peace, eternity. So, building an evidence-based consensus. How do you do that? How can we reach across the corridor? But that's what we're hoping we can do. There's the hope aspect. You can't just sort of close the shutters and bury yourself in it. You've got to get out there and do what you can do. And it's a matter of listening to everyone's viewpoint and kind of having honest and respectful conversations about that. Making sure, most people accept, there should be fairness in society. Even those people who are operating in an unfair kind of world. I mean, they're not going to say they disagree with fairness. Moving to a well-being economics, and there's a whole movement about that. Building that connectivity of people and nature, whānau, village, cityhood, nature, art, music, creativity, nationhood, and creating a model for the world. I mean, we can start here. We've got lots of privileges here. We can do this. And building ecological literacy and underpinned by ethics and civics. In other words, technology and AI and all of these things, it needs to be underpinned by understanding of our social responsibility. It's so easy to game the world, and in the end, no one benefits from that. We need to kind of step back and breathe. Reverse that extinction of experience, build that identity, kaitiakitanga, have a regenerative, everything's regenerative ideas these days, regenerative farming, regenerative urban development. We need to just get on with it. And, address these sorts of questions. Gosh, we could have all these wonderful things, energy independence, preserve rainforests, green jobs, clean water, healthy and everything. And then there's always that one person in the back of the room who says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Oh my God, wouldn't that be just so terrible? I think we do have the answers. You have the answers, we have the answers, you know, they're out there.